As a DM, one of the most beautiful and rewarding experiences is imagining up an epic fantasy setting and then inviting your players to get immersed in that setting and bring it to life.
But as a first-time dungeon master, creating all the elements that you need to create a complete, immersive, and detailed fantasy world can feel overwhelming, like it's a monumental task. Today we're going to focus in and talk about where you need to get started when you're creating your very own homebrew D&D campaign setting. My name is Monty Martin.
And I'm McLaughlin.
And we are the Dungeon Dudes. Welcome to our channel where we discuss everything Dungeons & Dragons, including guides for dungeon masters and advice for players.
We upload new videos every Thursday, so please subscribe to our channel so that you never miss an episode.
Today we're taking an in-depth look at the first steps you need to take when creating material for your very own campaign setting. And we're going to be focusing on this question of what does a Dungeons & Dragons campaign setting actually need?
Well, one thing you're going to need is heroes. So let's get rolling.
Your world is the setting for the fantastic adventures of your player characters.
And you can use this setting as a series of building blocks that you use to inspire and create adventures for those characters. But each of these blocks needs to serve a purpose.
I just want to preface this episode by saying that world building is a deeply personal process, and every creator is always going to develop their own ways for making worlds that work for them.
We've developed this episode based on a lot of trials and mistakes that Monty and myself have run into while creating our own homebrewed world. It's those trials and mistakes that we're talking about today to kind of show you guys ways that we have found help us make it easier to build a campaign setting and homebrew a world.
Your Dungeons & Dragons campaign setting is an immersive game world that exists to facilitate adventures. Whenever we're telling a story, we like to think about the plot, the character, and the settings as the core pillars of that story. But in Dungeons & Dragons, unlike screenwriting and novels, you as the Dungeon Master are not an author. You don't have control of all three things of the setting, the plot, and the characters. You really only control the setting because your players are going to influence the characters and the plot as well.
The player characters are not the center of the world that you've created. However, they are definitely the protagonists in the campaign setting.
And your adventure is the story that you're going to tell together. It's important to not lose sight of this fact because we want everything that we put into our campaign worlds to serve a purpose. Not just a purpose that makes sense within the world itself, but a purpose that we can use in our adventures and our narratives, something that our characters can interact with and engage with. This is where world building overlaps with adventure design, and thinking about what our adventures really need from the world is more important than thinking about what the world is going to say about the adventures happening in it.
As it turns out, most good adventures have key elements that overlap with world building, which gives you a series of adventure elements. These are important to create first because they will be integral in running the game.
These adventure elements start off with things like fantastic locations for your player characters to explore, like the Marsh of Madness or Skull Mountain. Every campaign needs to have Skull Mountain somewhere in it.
Your world also needs monsters and other terrible foes to fight, like dreaded orcs or evil fiends.
Of course, not everything in your setting is going to necessarily be hostile, and you'll want to create a cast of non-player characters to act as allies, patrons, traitors, rivals, and even enemies and foes to your player characters.
A good adventure also needs problems and mysteries. An army amassing on the border, or an evil cult that's kidnapped civilians.
Secondly, your world needs to be filled with treasures and secrets, ancient artifacts from bygone ages, and forgotten lore that can reveal the secrets of your world.
And lastly, your world needs settlements for the player characters to rest, recuperate, and plan their next moves in.
When you're just getting started, a Dungeons & Dragons adventure really only needs 1, 2, or 3 things from each of these categories in order to feel full and complete and give your players lots of things to do. But a full campaign, and indeed an entire setting, is going to need much more variety than this.
It doesn't necessarily make for an exciting campaign if you're exploring the same ruins, hanging out in the same settlement for the entire time that you're playing from levels 1 to wherever you go.
But we can solve this problem in one of two ways. The first option is by creating many more elements for our world. Multiple non-player characters, multiple locations, settlements, and filling those with monsters, treasures, and secrets. A really good example of this is the Peninsula of Chult in the Tomb of Annihilation campaign, which is a large hex map that each hex has a few cool adventure elements inside it. But then the whole thing taken together feels really complete.
The other option is to create a detailed and reoccurring setting, location, NPC, or problem that changes over time.
Really good examples of this include Barovia from Curse of Strahd, which only has 2 or 3 villages and a big castle, and one very prominent villain as the core non-player character in the campaign, or Waterdeep Dragon Heist, which takes place entirely in one incredibly detailed city with a handful of very prominent non-player characters.
Many dungeon masters will adopt a combination of both elements when creating a campaign setting. As their campaign setting moves along, they can choose in the moment whether to enhance a certain element, NPC, location, or problem, or move on to something new.
And of course, many of these adventure elements only need 1 or 2 sentences of description or a small map that you might have found on the internet or an image that you've searched for or taken yourself in order to give you all the material that you need to run them in your game. A campaign world is going to develop organically as you keep adding details and adding new things to your setting. You'll notice that this list doesn't really address the specific culture, geography, or history of your world, nor does it really include the big conceptual idea or the theme or tone that underlies your entire campaign setting or world. And the reason for this is that these things like culture, themes, tones, are things that we add as narrative elements to give context and meaning to the adventure elements. They're interchangeable, and any campaign setting could take Skull Mountain and change it by putting it in a different context that gives it the themes appropriate for that world.
We can introduce setting characteristics as they appear in our adventures and then weave them in organically to the setting.
When you devise a handful of adventure elements and then use your setting characteristics to give them context, meaning, and link them together as your players go from one adventure to the next, it allows you to reveal your setting and its world through the adventures of the player characters themselves.
This is what some writers refer to as the exploratory or discovery method of world creation. It's the idea that your players don't need to have everything laid out for them before they set out on their adventure, because they'll be adding to that story as they move forward.
The Dungeon Master's Guide and many other world builders make a couple key recommendations when you're starting out creating your world that are in actual fact not necessary to running the game of Dungeons and Dragons. It might feel like these elements are necessary for a whole and complete cohesive world. The truth of the matter is that a Dungeons and Dragons adventure can feel cohesive, immersive, and complex even when the world itself is incomplete and incoherent, because only the elements involved in the adventure itself need to be detailed. When you get started creating your world, we encourage you to focus on creating your adventure elements. But there's actually a few things that we recommend you avoid creating in detail when you get started.
For example, you do not need an elaborate cosmology for your entire world before you start playing in a campaign setting.
Now, some campaigns are about the conflicts of the deities, or might be spanning across different planes of existence. That case aside, you don't need to decide the entire list of deities and all of their domains and worshippers and every single religion that's going to go into your world. If you haven't thought about what deity is associated with the trickery domain, you don't need to answer that question until a player actually wants to create a cleric with the trickery domain, And then you can talk to them about those options and get inspired by what your player character needs for their character's personality and background.
You also don't need to complete an entire world map before jumping into the campaign. Focus more on where your campaign starts, and don't worry so much about the entire world.
While creating a world map is a lot of fun, and it's a great artistic exercise, you don't need to create an expansive and detailed one when you're starting out. Deciding on things like where do every player character race live in your world, or what are all the different nations in your world, are questions that you can actually answer again when the player characters ask you for them.
For example, you don't have to plan where Tabaxi and Aarakocra fit into your world, unless one of your players says, I'd like to play a Tabaxi or Aarakocra, and then you can start to elaborate on how that fits into your setting.
Maybe even you haven't decided where dwarves live in your campaign setting, or all the different elven subraces. You don't need to make those decisions right away, and you don't even need to include all those races if you don't want to. But when a player asks you, can I play one? You can work with them to describe and develop what the history and culture of this race is going to be, and how that will then factor into the adventures that you go on. If a player character wants to say that they're from a far-off land, you could work with them to devise it, even at just sketching out the rough details, and then add that to your world as it's needed. It really makes your world feel much more vast and much more mysterious if the entire thing hasn't quite been mapped out yet. And in fact, in full disclosure, don't tell Kelly, but in the Dungeons of Drakkenheim campaign, I don't have a world map at all for my setting. I have a list of some of the different nations and approximately what direction they are from Drakkenheim, but the only overworld map that I've created for my campaign is the map of the city of Drakkenheim itself, because that was the only map that I really needed to have to run the campaign.
I'm literally right here. I can hear you. You also don't need to work out the detailed history of every event that took place from the creation of the world all the way up to the moment that your party leaves on their adventure.
This is one area where you can actually draw a lot of great inspiration from the real world, because real world history has a lot of gaps, unknowns, and mysteries. There's a lot of unanswered questions and a lot of things that we just don't fully understand about our own human history. And so it's perfectly fine for there to be massive gaps in your own world's history too, and for the typical person in your world, even some well-educated people, to not really fully understand what happened outside their own lifetimes. Your adventures always happen in the present. And when the past has an influence on that adventure, that's when you can explore why it's important to give context to what's happening in your world, rather than necessarily needing to spend a ton of time writing out a massive timeline detailing events and histories that are never going to come up in your campaign. Especially with history, it often is one of the best ways to give an impact and context to the events of your adventures, but only work on those things when they're really going to matter for what the player characters are doing.
You also don't need to worry about realistic socioeconomics or cultural demographics in your campaign world.
You have to be really careful that you're not spending too much time fixating on these realistic demographics, because by and large, your player's willing suspension of disbelief is going to smooth over a lot of the minor discontinuities. Many players haven't done the research, and they don't really know how valuable a goat was in the Middle Ages and how that plays into the fantasy economics of your world. So those details aren't really important. Maybe there is an adventure where the influence of a guild is important and the amount of money they're making is important. But the players will get it if you just say that it's important to the characters. They don't need to know all the checks and balances. So when it comes to things like your cosmology, your world map, your history, and the economics, social dimensions, and culture of your world, it's okay to leave a lot of gaps.
By creating the adventure hooks and the way that the campaign's going to move forward first, you can actually look at all of these topics and decide which ones are important to the current plot line and which ones you don't need. If cosmology or a world map or something of that sort is detailed out by what the player characters are going to be experiencing in the campaign, then making point form notes or even elaborating further on those could be very useful. But generally speaking, if you write out a whole page of history on something that will never impact the actual story arc that the characters are progressing through, then it's wasted time.
Now, it still might be fun for you to do that, and I get a lot of enjoyment out of imagining these fantastic worlds. But your time is precious, and don't let complex world building get in the way of your adventure preparation, because what's happening at your table is paramount to the experience of playing Dungeons & Dragons. Another way that doing excessive amounts of world building can take away from your gameplay experience is that oftentimes when we make things like a detailed cosmology or long-lasting histories or a world map, you lock in details in your own mind, and it prevents you from being open to the player character's interpretations and ideas and new discoveries and improvisations that come from play. We can develop things like new deities, where a specific player character race or monster exists in the world, or what organizations might exist to support characters of a certain class, when our players ask us to create these details to give context and meaning to support their characters, or when we need to introduce them in our adventures.
And actually deciding all of these things beforehand can actually be a hindrance to creating your world. Because when your players come to you with ideas or things that they want to pursue, and you have preconceived notions on what's happening in your world, you've locked in these ideas, meaning that there's not really any room to change or expand or alter them moving forward.
And this is one of the most powerful ways that you can make your world develop in an organic fashion with the collaboration of your player characters. Of course, you still get to be the arbiter of what your world is going to be like, and it is your world. But welcoming the contributions of your player characters in this way does make it feel like a living and breathing place and lets you enjoy discovering unexpected elements that you never even imagined could be a part of your world.
Even if you love foreshadowing, if you have point form notes on some of these concepts, you can foreshadow what may happen, and then when the characters move towards those goals, you can then start to elaborate on what is going to occur or what the events look like or the cosmology or history that surrounds that particular foreshadow.
Allow your world to be a big and expansive place with lots of unanswered questions, and seize on that attribute of a fantasy world, that it has mysteries, that it has things that people haven't discovered yet, and use it to your advantage to save you work. Focus on the things that are really going to come up in your game and heighten the mystery of everything else, and just leave a few point form notes to fill in the gaps later.
Not to mention, your players are going to feel more rewarded and more engaged if the story has taken elements from what they've created for their characters and ties them into the world. Rather than you spending hours creating a world that the players just happen to be part of, it makes it feel more like your campaign setting is about the characters.
The final thing is that it also saves at the table a lot of looking up in your notes the details of things that you wrote down weeks, months, or even years ago. If you allow yourself to improvise answers to the questions the player characters might have during the game session, you can write those notes down and build them and bake them into the context of the rest of your world, rather than necessarily needing to double check and make sure that what you're saying to your players in the moment is accurate within the notes that you created before. Ultimately, anything that you haven't explicitly revealed to your players is fair game for revision.
It's always fine to take time between adventures or campaigns to rewrite or retcon things that are happening within your world. As Monty just said, if it hasn't been revealed yet, or even if it's been hinted at or alluded to or loosely talked about, there's still room for you to change and recreate it. Also, who's to say that an NPC's version of history that they gave the players is 100% accurate?
Exactly. Everything that is talked about in your campaign world is always filtered through the subjective lens of whoever's talking about it. History is a very subjective thing and relies on the observations and retellings of the people that remembered it. There's that famous line, History is often written by the victors, and you can capitalize on the contradictions and subjective experiences of the people that live in your world to smooth out those discontinuities. Nobody knows all the answers of all the details of the real world, and adding that and injecting that into your campaign setting really makes it feel like a more grounded and believable place.
So this has been our look at getting started with world building in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. If you have any methods, tips, or tricks for building your own worlds, let us know about them in the comments below.
If you're enjoying the show, please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. You can find out how by following the links in the description below.
And if you want to check out our live play Dungeons of Drakkenheim, it airs Tuesday nights at 6 p.m. Eastern on Twitch. You can find all the previous episodes right up over here.
And we've got a fantastic playlist for Dungeon Masters on world building and much more right up over here.
Please subscribe to our channel so that you never miss an episode.
Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time
in the dungeon.